of agreement. Tim, would you like to be Energy Minister?
We have an Energy Minister and his name is Angus Taylor, and I'm sure he'll do a fun and
no interest at all. You've got I noticed you've probably got the qualifications.
Having academic qualifications is always the basis in which you actually select ministers. In fact, sometimes it can be an adverse thing, but it's nice of you to say.
Okay, now... Can I say, I wouldn't want to be one.
You wouldn't?
I wouldn't want to be an energy minister. One thing that's forgotten in this whole debate is that the grid belongs to the states. Right? So when Josh Frydenberg picked up the poison chalice of promising that he was going to bring down power prices and reduce emissions and improve reliability, he had very few levers to do so, and it had to go to the states for most of it. So it's impossible, it's really the wrong portfolio or the wrong responsibility to address the issues that Angus Taylor is hoping to fix.
Sorry, can I just contest that? Not to be contrarian, because one of the big problems we've had in energy policy is, of course, the federal government controls the levers of basically what our international emissions commitments are. And obviously we make that, but it doesn't mean it necessarily sits in alignment with the policies of the different states. And when we have, even though it's still within the realm of the states, a national electricity market, it's actually important to get those policy frameworks in alignment and in place. Now, that was actually the point of the National Energy Guarantee, to deal with, frankly, a lot of the problems around federalism. So there is still a need for a federal energy minister, but you're right, most of the actual levers about what you want to do sit with the states, but we do need a much closer alignment between the Commonwealth and the states.
I'm wondering if it might be actually easier to get rid of the states. Never mind.
No.
Well, no, I'd say, thank goodness we have the states, because all the action that's happening is happening at a state level. If you look at the emissions, if we go through Australia's communique into the UNFCCC process, where our charts came from today, a lot of the emissions reductions, especially in the electricity sector, coming forward, are coming through the states. New South Wales, Victoria, Queensland, ACT, South Australia and Tasmania, not WA. I think even NT, all those regions all have emissions or renewables targets that are in force and starting to show early results.
Will more renewables increase or decrease electricity prices?
There's a report out this morning on it. I don't know if you saw the one that
hang on, I was actually going to answer it. It's not as straightforward as saying yes or no. It depends on what you do and how you do it, and how we seek to put them into the market. As one of the slides that I showed was the comparison of the different prices of the different structures of electricity, and one of the, I feel like I kept going back to it around the neck. Obviously, if anybody read the media, I was supportive of it, was that it was designed to deal with the challenges over the next 5 to 10 years around that transition and adjustment, as prices adjust, as much as issues around reliability as well. So depending on the technology you put in, you can put more renewables in and increase the price. You can also put more renewables in and it can decrease the price. It also depends on what the future policy settings are around carbon risk, which companies then have to factor in. So, and that can compare against from renewables to renewables. One of the things that obviously the federal government is still looking into is the Snow 2.0 proposal, which, if the cost is absorbed by the Commonwealth when it comes to household prices, when cost is absorbed by the taxpayer, I know that in the end money is paid for by people, but you can actually offset that. So it depends on the policy framework that you're operating in. You were going to talk about the report.
So there's a report out this morning. Green Energy Markets put out a report every quarter, and their analysis is that in the wholesale market, we're going to see prices about I think 45% lower within the next 3 years as a result of the massive build-out that's happening. But it's really important for people to realise that'll be the wholesale market might fall from $80 to $50, which is all of 3 cents on your bill. So, so much of the argy-bargy that's gone on, especially around the egg, has been around absolutely minuscule fractions of your bill.
So I'd agree, Tim?
Sorry?
Yeah, happy with that?
Well, there are things that Simon said throughout the night which I contest since you got the right to speak after me.
Go for it, yeah.
No, it's not so, it's more tonal and also, well, because some of them are important, like the arguments around that occurred in the party room. I mean, I was in that room at the time and had those debates and arguments with people. It wasn't really about emissions, it was much more about price. That was one point. You
So
talked about
with the neg, you mean? Or-
with the neg, yes. And the other thing you said was around the wrecking ball. The BCA was arguing about in terms of the economy. The slide you were presenting was only dealing with electricity. The basis in which they used that argument was that it would be economy-wide, not just be specific around electricity.
Well, I think they've said the same
other-
about the 50% renewable target.
Well, but as part of the overall package of the overall cuts in the economy. The other one was around the issues of reliability in AEMO, and it's true that we have a reliable grid overall. The challenge is that AEMO's projected out around reliability into the future are heavily dependent on strong demand management measures as well. So there are components to things. I just think we need to be technically accurate.
Well, reliability is, I'm a full bottle on reliability, and I've torn that report back to front, and the reporting on it in the media and by I guess our political class has been atrocious on reliability. We have an amazingly reliable grid. Nobody has lost any load in Victoria for more than a decade as a result of a shortage of generation. Sure, poles and wires, possums hit your poles and wires and cars, and transformers blow at the distribution level, but at the generation level, we have met the reliability standard every year for the last decade, and we will for the next decade, without significant reliance on demand response. But demand response is a great thing.
No, demand response has a place. I'm sort of amazed that sometimes people talk down demand response, because actually a lot of the time it can make a lot of logical sense. But if anybody doesn't know what we mean by demand response, it's to try and reduce consumption, particularly in the industrial level and during peak periods where there are incentives put in place where people don't continue to consume as much electricity. And they might have logical reasons to do so, because it might actually be more efficient to do so as much as anything else.
And there's a whole area of energy efficiency in residences, which is not really discussed much, which has got some good opportunity as well.
Sure. Has everybody put insulation in their roofs?
Well, it's amazing. Well,
hopefully.
we do this work in our business. It amazes me the number of people who haven't even replaced their light globes. Simon, you mentioned media. For both of you, has our media generally, I'm not picking on a particular sector, is our media sufficiently briefed on anything from climate science to the sort of things that we've been discussing recently? I mean, are they doing us any favours?
There aren't many journalists in Australia who have got their finger on the electricity pulse. There's a real tendency for a report will come out from AEMO, and the news article will be up within 1 or 2 hours from when the report hits, with the interpretation that has either come out of the Energy Minister's office or AEMO's media release. But there's very few journalists that these days have the time to read the report. So on the reliability report that came out last Thursday when things were kind of busy in Canberra.
It was Friday, I think.
Sorry, the embargo finished on Friday, and it was reported in the media that there's a 1 in 3 chance of blackouts in Victoria this summer. I don't know if anyone saw that headline. If you take 5 minutes to read the report, it is, if we don't do anything, then there is a 1 in 3 chance of small load sheds. And by doing something, what they're saying, if the Tesla battery doesn't exist in South Australia, if the generators that South Australia installed last summer are ripped out, and if AEMO doesn't fulfil their statutory responsibility, then there is a possibility of there being a 1 in 3 chance of some blackouts. It's sort of like saying that if the Reserve Bank, no one turns up to work, and all the road networks around it are blowing up, and they decide to not print any money, then there's a 1 in 3 chance that an ATM somewhere on the other side of Melbourne won't have some money in it in summer. Now, for me, that's not newsworthy. That's not newsworthy. And the chance of us having blackouts in Victoria this summer are close to zero, as they have been every summer recently and every summer that's going to come towards us, because we have people doing their job, and politicising it is one of the great tragedies of our time.
So Victoria's going to lose its brown coal power stations over the next, say, 30 years. What's the plan? What should we be thinking about doing?
Well, there's already some measures being put in place, and I say that some of they're going through stages. The one in particular has been a co-investment by the Japanese government, our government, around hydrogen power. Now, I'm cautious, I would say, about its capacity to work, because it's very heavily dependent on commercially viable CCS, carbon capture and storage. So that will be part of it. But I've got to say, I'm one of these people who's always been optimist about technology, always. And the power of technology to, at a competitive and affordable price, to deal with the challenges we have around a change in our energy generation over time. So what do we think the answer is going to be? The truth is, I'm not 100% sure we know what the answer is going to be. We know what the trajectories are roughly in terms of the capacity and price around some renewable types of technology. If we add on to the back of that sort of base load renewable technology, particularly around hydropower, as well as what will still probably be the consumption of a lot of black coal, in particularly New South Wales and Queensland, as well as combined cycle gas, and a much bigger spread and array, I think we'll be able to meet the challenges of it. But a lot of it's heavily going to come down to what is going to happen with technological innovation, our capacity to deploy it, because that's not just a challenge for us, it's a challenge for the world, including places where they've never had electricity before. But I find it difficult to see a scenario where it will be commercially viable to build anything to replace old or existing brown coal, and I can't see an environment at the moment where people are going to reinvest and maintain existing brown coal into the future.
This is not a Dorothy Dixer, but high efficiency, low emissions coal-fired power stations, Simon. I know you're all over social media about those.
So this phrase, high efficiency, was it high efficiency, low emissions? Yeah, and you've been there, right? I've been to one of them. We've got 4 in Australia, so you didn't even have to go there. This
not
coal.
The latest ones.
Sorry?
Not the latest ones.
So it's a marketing term for a class of coal power stations, the first one of which in the world shut down last year after 60 years of operation, Avon Lake in the US. It's not a new technology. It's not low emissions. It's about 10 to 20% lower than our regular black coal fleet. It's not highly efficient. It moves up from about 35% to maybe 45% if you're really, really lucky, but the rest of the heat still goes up the chimney. And it's not cheap. It's certainly more expensive than the portfolio approach that we're seeing. I mean, if it was cheap, we'd be seeing people angling to build them in Australia, and I call them slightly lower intensity, more expensive, or SLIME for short.
Cute. I don't quite agree with the comment that we'd see them people building them if they were cheap, because, as I tried to explain before, one of the big challenges in this space is that people don't make energy investments, but it's not a consumer product. You don't just buy it like a lolly at the shop. The return rate is over 15-year periods, and nobody quite knows what the policy is.
Much longer.
Or longer, yes. Yeah. Well, I would say the 15-year is the return on the capital. Then after about that, then you start to enjoy the profits from it, once you factor in maintenance costs. But the policy risk environment is real. It is real. Sure. And no one knows where it's going to go over time. And the other thing, and this isn't to advocate for or against, I'm a technology neutral guy, but the newer Healy plants, if you look at them objectively, do also potentially include multiple turbines off the basis of not just the combination of coal and gas, but also the potential of coal, gas and fuel cells. Now, the fuel cell component is speculative, but that could potentially do something more in terms of increasing the amount of output and making it a higher return for lower emissions.
CSIRO, I've heard them last year propose they want to build a solar power station in Pilbara half the size of Tasmania, which they're going to generate hydrogen from, and they've got this new metal membrane that they expect to be able to transport the hydrogen as ammonia and put the ammonia, or take the ammonia to Southeast Asia and push it through this metal membrane to re-extract the hydrogen. Their intention is to change the energy economics of Southeast Asia. Some really big gains. A couple of questions before I take some questions from the floor. Tim, just a couple of insights perhaps from last week. We are told that
I'm being filmed, right?
No. Well, yes. You can answer this. Hey, we're told that the LNP is committed to climate science. Can you assure us that Angus Taylor, the new minister who says he is?
Well, I'm a member of the Liberal Party. I'm not a member of the Liberal and National Party, and I take that view very strongly.
Sure, yeah.
It might seem like a point. I mean, you can only take the minister on his word, which is he said that, you know, he's a sceptic on the economics of aspects of it. And the truth is, I've been sceptic on economics of some aspects of climate change in the past. And I mean, I'm sceptical of all authority, frankly, including my own office. So just to make it clear, but he's sceptical on those things. And that's, I think, frankly, an entirely healthy thing. Because
I've had a bit to do with Angus over the years. I met him first through when I was working in the wind area. He, as I've said quite freely, nobody has worked harder in Australian politics than Angus in shutting down the wind industry, and you could probably say no one's worked harder than Angus in shutting down renewables in Australia. So for me, it's a great disappointment.
That's a big call.
It is a big call, but I think he's very dangerous on this, in that he does he talks the talk about accepting climate science, but he's presentable. He's got a good sense. He's got a consulting background, and he's a Rhodes Scholar. So he comes across
McKinsey, right?
And McKinsey, comes across very powerful in the arguments he makes. But one of the first, before 3 months, I think, before he entered the party. But before he was elected, he put around a paper in the party room that was advocating that we kill the RET, just stop the RET exactly where it was, the renewable energy target, and replace it with gas. And it was a very nicely put together consultant report saying, looked like it made a very compelling case, but if we had done that, it would have been an absolute disaster. Not only would we have to frack the whole country to pieces, but in the interim years, renewables are about a third of the cost of where Angus had them, and gas has tripled in price. So we would have locked ourselves in for high emissions, highly fracked, and very expensive energy. And so Angus is able to spin those messages, and he will continue doing so, and will do so forcefully.
Sorry, I need to clarify.
But the content will be very questionable.
But I think this is the point, which. Nobody knows what the future is going to be like, and okay. Can someone tell me what Tats Lotto numbers are next week? Thanks. Nobody knows what the technology is going to be like in the future if we're going to take this seriously. And there is, I agree. I mean, one of the criticisms I used to make a lot of government policies in the earlier periods, particularly in around the 2007 earlier periods, is heavily focused on the fact that there were technologies that were deploying that would be substantially cheaper in the future, and it actually wasn't a good decision if you wanted to reduce emissions to deploy them at the time, because you were spending a lot of capital on things that could deploy. I mean, if you go back and look at one of Kevin Rudd's chief economists, he wrote an essay on, I can't remember what the title of it was a quarterly essay in 2010, I think, where he talked about the fact that emissions trading policies were actually not good at driving technological innovation, they were good at driving technological deployment. But if it's not economically competitive to drive that technological deployment, it doesn't mean that you get a better outcome. This is part of why the transition matters. And when you go back and look at, I haven't seen this paper on Angus's part, but I wouldn't be... Sorry?
I'll flick it to you later.
But the reality is, you can say what might have happened had we committed to it in the same way I could say certain things about other policies if we had have implemented it. There's adjustments and there's a transition, and this is why it's not good to put all eggs in one basket.
Yeah, one of the slides you showed before was Finkel's estimate of the costs of the technologies, and it was this paper. Finkel came out 14 months ago and said wind was $95 was the cost of wind. Well, a month before Finkel came out, Stockyard Hill wind farm contracted at 52. So instead of 95, at $52, which is below the cost of the coal alone going into a new heli plant. So. So folks who were back then saying we shouldn't help, that renewables were too expensive and we shouldn't help them, and Angus has made very strong case all the way along that renewables receive $85 per certificate subsidy and will all the way to 2030, and he multiplies that out, and it sounds very impressive. But what we did then is we worked really hard to exercise a supply chain, and the project finance and the product development that brought wind down from where it was $150 back in 2010 to now it's a third of that cost. And we'll have the Victorian Renewable Energy Target first round of results will be announced in the next couple of weeks, and there'll be lots of other projects that will be at impressively low prices. And that happened because we put in the Renewable Energy Target and exercised all of our supply chain to deliver that. And it's the
There's
lack
actually
of
higher uptake in parts of the RET in terms of the number of certificates and.
Sorry, what?
No, as in the RET had a very high uptake in terms of certificates, and actually over time they're going to become less important in terms of the profile.
They already, in projects like Stockyard Hill, the certificates have a $0 value to the project, so the projects are now getting up unsubsidised, which is amazing. And to have that, to have someone so clever, so educated, trying to stop that happening. Thank goodness he failed, and hopefully he's realised that. But from his media conference today, I'm not so sure.
Let's pause, gentlemen. I need to start taking some questions from the floor. So I want to give you at least,
yeah,
I think you'll only have about 2 minutes at the end to wrap up. Perhaps you might even, Simon, you might, if you were Minister for Energy, what would your policy be? We'd like to hear that. There's a gentleman here. Now, we've got a choice. You can use the microphone here on the lectern, but I think if you make sure you call out that, please no statements, just ask a question.
Tim's my name.
The issue is very simple for me. It seems to me your side of politics doesn't recognise that we're in existential crisis. In fact, actually seem in denial of that. I don't care how cheap you make my electricity or how expensive you make it if I'm not going to have a habitable planet to have here. So do you accept that we need an emergency response? We are in an existential crisis.
I'll tell you what I accept, which is that I've watched this policy and been involved in this policy debate for over a decade. And what I've watched is people make a lot of bold pronouncements and policy options, and they haven't come to pass because, one of the things Simon said wrong before was that Tony Abbott shelved the CPRS, and no, he didn't actually, it was Kevin Rudd. Now, I'm not disputing the fact that Tony Abbott fought against it, but what I've seen is this policy area is one where absolutism leads to nothing, most of the time. And one of the challenges we have, and I can show you constituents within my electorate who are concerned about some of the other factors like price and reliability in their community. And so part of our task is to adapt and move with technological innovation and what we can do pragmatically to address the challenge that we have, which is we need to both, yes, address emissions, yes, make sure that particularly power is affordable, while also making sure it's reliable. So is there a challenge? I'm absolutely saying yes, but we have to be pragmatic about making sure we address it.
Where we end up with there, though, is with that idea that absolutism leads to nothing, we end up with nothing, right?
That's right.
We have
That's
nothing right now, and what we expect of our leaders is that they approach this as adults, not as toddlers.
Sure.
Let's move on to another question.
Right? And we need a policy, but it looks like there's not one on the horizon.
Well, no, I don't agree with that. I mean, we had a policy. The current policy has been shelved. We're now seeking to develop an alternative policy framework to actually deal with the challenges that are in front of us.
So we can expect an emissions policy sometime soon?
Oh, I think absolutely yes.
You heard it here, guys.
Let's move on to another question.
Well, I mean, let's be clear, and this is one of the frustrations I do have with some people, is that at the last election, I ran on an election platform that we would honour a 26 to 28% reduction in emissions off 2005 levels. It was absolutely the policy platform.
Yep.
Let's take another question. Gentleman here.
Hi. The topic is government policy and climate change. We're talking about carbon dioxide. Hi. The topic is government policy and climate change. We're talking about Paris, we're talking about carbon dioxide, but we're not perhaps talking about methane, for example, and the issue with methane is that over a 20-year period, it's got 100 times the warming effect of carbon dioxide. It also dissipates within 7 to 10 years. So, and I'm not going to get into the cowspiracy space, but just doing your own math, we have
26 million cows in this country. So stepping away from Paris, energy, renewables, government policy in the other space, because it is almost, by my reckoning, as big a problem as energy production in terms of warming effect.
Simon and I actually agree on this point, which is in both of our slides, when we talk about CO2, we're talking about CO2 equivalent gases, which basically makes methane and other gases comparable in their volume to CO2. Now, but I know the point you're making, which is in agriculture, you have a concentration of methane, particularly coming as a consequence of livestock. And that when we're talking about energy, we're not talking about those issues, which is part of what other policy measures outside of dealing with the NEG was designed to achieve in the past. And Simon and I have both discussed that we are not experts in this area.
But I will say,
Go for it.
I had a fascinating discussion with the National Farmers Federation, who they backed the NEG. They said, we love the NEG, we want to see the NEG getting up. And I went to them and said, the NEG is saying that the electricity sector will only do 26% emissions reduction. That means you guys have got to do 26% emissions reduction in agriculture. How are you going to do it? And there are some ideas that maybe we can feed seaweed to cows, or we can, put bags over their head to capture. None of that works. We don't have any real ideas on how we're going to reduce emissions from agriculture. So we have to do more in the sectors where it's cheap. And just one metric that I gave to them: if we do 26% emissions reduction in agriculture, it's about 19 million tonnes a year they've got to pull out of their sector. The Lawn Power Station, which is on its last legs and about to fall over, is 14 million. So you've got 19 million is what agriculture's got to do, and 14 million from one crappy old brown coal power station. So actually, it's so much easier to do things in the electricity sector, and the NEG wasn't going to do that.
Lady at the back, can you call out loudly? And there was a gentleman. Where was I looking? The gentleman with the black coat on will be next. Do you want to come to the microphone and wait?
I'd just like to make a quick comment to Tim.
Questions only, please. You've only got.
Okay, I won't
we've got 18 minutes left, and we need questions quickly.
Well, given that we're at the top of the 2% club, I think government policy addressing climate change needs to be more about more than domestic policy. So I'm asking, why is our federal government continuing to export coal? We are the world's biggest exporter of coal, and we are still opening new coal mines for export to other countries. So that's a huge contributor to climate change, and I think Australia needs to address that.
Will it get up?
Okay. That one's quite straightforward. We continue. I agree with you, by the way, that our policy framework, and it is set against also recognising what other countries do. In fact, proportionality is actually central to the way government, Liberal or Labor, by the way, that approaches this task. But why do we continue to export coal? Because it's in demand. And that's the reality of it, because people want to buy it because they have coal-fired power stations that they need to drive, and if they don't buy it from us, they buy it from somewhere else. That is, you can sell shame as much as you want. That's the reality.
That's the drug pushers' argument, isn't it?
No, that's.
Yeah.
That's cute, but the reality is that people actually need energy so that they don't freeze in winter, and they actually, in countries not like ours, people actually do get very cold, and ours included, people continue to use it. And as the technology changes, if you're right, and the technology will move at such a rate, you will actually see a decrease in the consumption of coal. The reality is the International Energy Agency and others show that that isn't going to be some dramatic reduction.
But we'd like them to, right? We'd like them to use less coal.
Well, I'd like the technology to get to the point where people don't need to use it.
Yep.
Question here, gentlemen.
Thank you. My name is Peter. There's two or three parts to this, mainly to Tim. I'm concerned at the lack of focus on the big picture. When we fail to act, we're kicking the can down the road to our children and our grandchildren. Where is the modelling? Where is the modelling that says if we fail to act, what are the costs in 25 years, 50, 100 years That's the first part. The second part, with Taylor coming out and saying we're just going to focus on electricity prices, UK recently said with the extremes of climate change, farmers are less productive in the winter because of the cold, and they're less productive in the summer because of the heat. So food costs are going up. That's a cost in addition to electricity costs. Over and beyond that, we've got the farmers in Australia getting a handout right now of $1.8 billion, which they properly need. That's another cost. So the total costs need to bring into account all of these costs that I'm talking about. And any grade 3 kid can tell you that. So if the government just focuses on the front electricity bill, that's not enough. And the final question is, governments are influenced by lobbyists and donations. How much money has the coalition received in the last 5 years from the energy lobby? I want a number in dollars. Thank you.
I think that was directed at you.
Yeah, I assume it's directed at me. No, the answer to the last question, no idea. You can find out at aec.gov.au. I don't know the answer. In terms of the focus on energy policy, the energy policy is focused on reducing prices. That's true, but the Environment Minister has responsibility for reducing emissions, so it won't be a policy in isolation. It'll be part of a package of measures that the government seeks to advance and address. And one of the challenges we have when we're in government, it doesn't matter who's in government, and if you were in my shoes, it wouldn't change either, is you have to balance competing objectives. And so we have to make sure that we are delivering affordable energy. We have to ensure we deliver reliable energy. We have to make sure we reduce our emissions at the same time. And there are policy settings that we have to get to do all of them. And, imagine if Australia reduced its emissions profile to zero tomorrow. Does anybody think that the public would just accept that in terms of the consequences? Because there are consequences. So our task is to manage and adjust with the transition, because if we reduced our emissions tomorrow,
but you've got to have a plan.
We could turn off.
But you've got to have a plan, and
sure, I accept that.
You guys don't have a plan at all.
No, we had a policy that's been shelved, and we're now looking at
alternative that policy wasn't actually going to deliver on the plan.
Well, this is where we'll have a polite disagreement. I actually disagree. I actually think the policy, the NEG policy, was actually a foundationally good policy. It needed extra measures to deal with.
But you saw that red line, right? You saw that red line, that there was no emissions reduction over a decade. That's not a response to this issue we're talking about tonight.
Well, firstly, sorry? No. I'm quite proud of my position, so I'm not letting it go. I'm standing by it. Because in the end, it was a policy framework. It was not the end of this conversation, it was the beginning. Now, people who wanted us to cut more emissions said it wasn't enough. People who didn't want us to cut emissions said we shouldn't even go near it. This is the consequence of what happens when you're absolutist.
Let's take another question.
My name's Robin Dunphy. What I'd like to go back to Rob Gell's graph, where we had this really deep red dip that we risk falling into.
Hothouse Earth in the Anthropocene.
Thank you. I couldn't remember it from before. But what concerns me is we spend so much time arguing about what our policies should be that we actually, as Simon said before, we don't really have one that's working. So what, Tim, are you going to do when we crash into that the nice red dip? The money and the economy that we're arguing about now will mean absolutely nothing, will it not? Because we won't be alive to have an economy. What are you going to do about that?
Let me pick that up, because scientists have been reticent to do it, but if you did speak to Hans-Joachim Schellenhuber, who runs the Potsdam Institute, who's one of the authors of that paper, he would actually give you the policy to avoid that proposed catastrophe. And it's not anything like any of the policies we've seen over the last 20 years. It's much more severe in its need to reduce emissions. So the scientists of the world, coming back to the comment about climate science, the first question, perhaps it does, we won't assume it produces gives us an existential threat, but the best scientists on the subject in the world are telling us that's where we're going unless we actually develop a policy and act on it very quickly.
I maintain my very strong confidence that we're actually going to have the technological innovation to address these challenges. Okay, well, I've kind of taken that view to date, and we've actually seen dramatic changes in the energy system, which is actually delivering the emissions profile
Just one
that you
sector.
now want.
Just one sector.
That's right, and that's one sector, and I believe we'll see the same in other policy areas as well. And it's going to come from international collaboration and focus on how we improve the outcome in terms of reducing emissions. If you want to be pessimistic about that, that's your choice. I'm an optimist.
Well, I think the role of government is to try to put the settings in place to encourage it, right? And we have nothing in any sector of the economy that's set to do anything significant in any of these areas.
No, I actually disagree with that very strongly, because in the end there has always been a commercial viability and opportunity from finding ways to reduce consumption around particularly energy, but not in isolation. The same is also true in other sectors, to reduce the amount of use in demand in order to produce something.
But agriculture's got there's no gentle hand trying to push agriculture towards reducing emissions in that sector.
And this is where we need to invest more money and research in trying to drive that change. I agree with that.
Right, so do it.
Yeah, sure. But
Gentlemen?
it's a cute thing for somebody to say, but I'm one member of 150 Parliament. I don't get to dictate policy.
I think we've probably got time for one or two, or perhaps even these three, perhaps four. We'll try and get...
Yeah, we're at 9 o'clock. So I've just noticed that I've dug my heels in so hard because my heart is beating so fast because I've come here tonight to hear, does government policy adequately address climate risk? And I can't hear that. And as a young person, I'm kind of sitting here going, we're fucked. And so I want to hear leadership, and I want to hear a plan. I want to know what to do. I'm trying my best to wrap my head around everything that I'm hearing tonight. I'm trying my very best. And I know everyone else here is too, and you're all trying your best. But what is the plan? I want to, like, as soon as you said a scientist would say a plan, I was like, tell me the plan. I just want to know the plan. So what is the plan? Where is the leadership? I'm hearing the government's managing. I don't want management, I want leadership. And that's a different approach. So what is the leadership plan? Is there one or isn't there one?
Well,
You should have a go, and then I'll ask him what he would do.
I mean, there has been leadership.
Let him finish.
I mean, I'm enjoying the collective groans every time I say something. It really endears people to turning up to public forums. There has been leadership. You know what? Some of us stood up last week and the week before and stood up for a change in energy policy to address some of these issues. Some of us actually did. Go back and look at the official record. But it was only one part of what needs to be a much bigger matrix of policy solutions. We're working through them bit by bit, not just here, but around the world, because we could cut our emissions in Australia tomorrow. We still have to deal with the challenges in other countries, which is why technological innovation is so critical, because we have the problems and the unique issues that other countries face to deal with it. So we're working through them. If you want a solution tomorrow, you're not going to get it from anybody on this panel.
so yeah, I want to say that we have no policy, and that is deeply disappointing. And we have no plans to have a policy in Australia.
That's not true.
The new Prime Minister has heard very clearly that he could not get if you can't get a policy past the party room that does nothing, you're not going to get a policy that does something, that has an adequate response. I'm deeply disappointed in this, but what would the scientists tell you? The same thing as what the economists would tell you, and that's that we need an economy-wide carbon price. And I just want to say, we've had that, and I just want to say, more than, I'm not going to put Tim on the spot, and it's not fair to do so, and if you can imagine from Tim's perspective, being in that party room, there are many voices that spoke, and I hope that there are moderate people who can gradually educate the party and dispel the myths that are holding us back from effective action. But it's more than a few coalition MPs have told me over the last few years that they recognise that the repeal of the carbon price was a mistake. That it is a very, very difficult thing to get an effective policy in place we had one. And until we can have the bipartisan around getting that back in again, Australia's just going to spin its wheels, in my opinion.
China's done it. Okay, we can only afford one more question, I'm afraid. Then I'm going to give Tim and Simon just 2 minutes only to wrap up before I ask David to conclude. No wrap up from me, it's not necessary. Thank you.
I'm just addressing my question to the panel and anyone who wants to take it up. I recall Maurice Newman thought the Bureau of Meteorology had been infiltrated by left-wing activists, and he thought that the Bureau of Meteorology was engaged in a conspiracy. Fortunately, he's no longer the advisor to Australian business that Tony Abbott put in, and the new Prime Minister was notable for carrying a piece of coal into Parliament. But what concerns me is the attack on the media and the dumbing down of Australia, and particularly the Murdoch media. How are we going, with the attack on the ABC that we're seeing now? How are we, and the fact that Tony Abbott was the first Prime Minister that didn't have a Minister for Science for a long time. I'm just wondering, how are we going to get the information that we're hearing tonight out through our media so that we can actually make assessments on whether the government does or doesn't have a policy?
I'll be very flippant, and I'll provide you with the reference to the Proceedings of the National Academy of Science as a start. That's good information.
Just so you know, there's an entire policy document that I referred to tonight, which you can find at environment.gov.au, which goes through every part of the government's climate change policy.
Okay.
It's all aggregated there.
Okay. Simon, wrap up.
10 o'clock this morning we had the Energy Minister's first public statement where he said that this is the Minister responsible for the portfolio with the greatest emissions in our economy and capable of the greatest reductions at the least cost. Stood up and said that emissions are no longer aren't part of his remit. He's only going to be interested in getting energy prices down. As we said before, something where he has very small levers that really is state's responsibility. He then proceeded to say that South Australia's energy transition has been a failed experiment, and that makes me very sad to think that we are back at this whole thing again. What we need to get past this is bipartisanship built on facts, and to have a speech that was blame Labor on energy policy or paint South Australia as being a failed experiment was actually, it's a beacon to the world, and there is so much that the rest of the country and the rest of the world are learning from what's happening in South Australia. We've got to move past that, and I hope that there are moderate folks within the coalition, like Tim and others, who are going to work on our behalf to make sure that we get these, get the truth said and just get rid of this partisan bickering around energy.
There is actually legitimate reasons why people have different views on policy about how to deal with these challenges based on how they want to approach them. I mean, there are other political parties that might use a different colour than the one that I normally represent, let's put it that way, who decide to put emissions reductions at all costs, and there are consequences to their policies. They will see probably a high reduction in the amount of emissions, but they will see higher costs and it will have a bigger impact on the industrial base of Australia and everything else. And then Labor has a different position, One Nation has a different position, and of course the party that I represent has a different position. The task has always been how you manage a transition around the practical reality of reducing emissions from the source in which they come from, or their origin, to alternatives. And you can't jump to perfect alternatives because in some cases they don't exist. And that's not because I disagree with them or like them or dislike them, it's a practical reality. We know that renewable energy, which is an important part of our energy mix today and will be an important component of the mix into the future, is part of a package of how we're going to adjust over time. If we had deployed all the renewable energy that some people wanted back in the late 90s, we would have a very clunky, inefficient system, very expensive and wouldn't deliver the energy that people need. So my position has always been how we work through the transition over time to deliver what the Australian people need. We also need to do it proportionate and assisting other countries. The best way to get other countries to reduce their emissions profile is to help have the technology that when they're installing, and we're principally talking about energy, there are other things as well, when they're installing energy for the first time, that they're introducing low footprint or no footprint energy generation, because those people want things like the right to development too. And so absolutism will not get you where you want to. Taking no compromises and working with people to adjust as things go along, adapting with technology, will not deliver the outcome you want. The task ahead of us is great and significant, and it requires an open mind to work with everybody to take the country forward together.
Thank you, Tim. I'm going to... No, we're already over time and I'm under instructions, but you might sorry?
There are two subjects which have not been really talked about.
All right, can they be quick? Are you happy to take these two questions?
Yeah, sure, why not?
Sure.
I'm a young person and I'm really angry at the state of politics in Australia. We have, as someone else mentioned, our new Prime Minister literally brought a lump of coal into Parliament. We have our new Energy Minister who today said we should open more coal and gas stations, and the advisor to the Prime Minister has formerly worked for the Minerals Council of Australia. What I want to ask is, how are you going to ensure that coal stays out of politics and fossil fuel stays out of politics and stops influencing how our politics goes? Because essentially that is why the whole system erupted last week, because there was people who wanted to actually tackle climate change and move away from fossil fuels to renewables, and there was no backbone from our politicians to stand up to the fossil fuel industry and say no for the sake of our future as young people.
I think you've just answered that.
I like to think of myself as young too. I don't
identify with you at all.
Okay, that's fine. Can I tell you honestly, it's a gross oversimplification to say mining industries are therefore controlling the parliament. It might work for a campaign banner.
Malcolm Turnbull's son said it directly
Don't do
into the media.
Don't do that.
Okay, so Malcolm Turnbull's son said it. Good for him. I'm saying to you, that's not how the reality of dealing with the challenges around assessing policy works. You look at all the different reviews and informed decision-making consideration. You're welcome to hold your view. I'm just saying I disagree with it and I'm entitled to do so. Because yes, I get people from the Minerals Council who come and explain to me what policy settings they think is right. Sometimes I agree with them. Sometimes I disagree with them. Simon and I were talking before about quotes on prices around new coal and what they think the price may be versus what I think it might be. And I don't agree with them on some of those numbers. I look at some of the stuff that's been done in the renewable energy space and, you know, I support that because I think that's practical and real. Now, does it make it any better that there are renewable energy interests who enjoy massive subsidies associated with that off the back of your tax dollars? Just because you agree with them?
Ooh,
yeah, there are lobbying.
Tim, if that's what you believe, that renewable energy receives large subsidies off the back of taxes, then we need to have a a because that's not the case.
$7 billion to the fossil
The
fuel
point is,
industry.
people lobby all the time. Our judgment is to...
Don't interrupt, please.
Okay.
Okay, well, fine. There are subsidies to fossil fuels, there are subsidies to renewables. The challenge we have is to make informed decisions based off the back of evidence. If you just want to say it's because of lobbying, that's fine, but you're actually not going about it the right way.
It was a week before the party room sat down and talked about it. The Minerals Council took Tim and 5 other MPs to Japan and showed them...
It was about 3 weeks, I think.
No, it was like 10, before COAG. It was the week before COAG, early August. Minerals Council took them to show them how amazing Japanese coal is. The messages that came back from that trip, not from you, from folks like Christensen and Craig Kelly. Craig Kelly, went with a letter from Canavan asking Japan to build 3, and there's photos on Facebook of Kelly saying, I want 3 power stations built in Australia.
He wanted that before the trip, I can tell you.
Sure. So, but when the Minerals Council create this environment of misinformation around folks like that, and fairly, maybe totally coincidentally, right before a significant party room meeting about our energy future, we have a large number of MPs who don't understand energy in Australia. We've politicised energy, we've fed them crap messages, and with the folks like the Minerals Council have an amazing influence on these people's decision making. Yeah, I think that's something that we do need to address if we want to have clear-eyed bipartisan policy.
Let's take a last question. Last question.
Thank you very much. First of all, I'd like to apologise to all those people who don't go anywhere near social media, but this week a rather strange video circulated that even the ABC's political editor, Laura Tingle, thought was a spoof. It was made by some young members of the IPA, the Institute of Public Affairs. And for those who don't know, it's, the IPA is a conservative policy think tank. Would I be right, Tim, in assuming you're still a member of the IPA? Mm-hmm. And so's Josh Frydenberg, just for another off the top of my head. So this video was made by some, I would have to describe them as strident young people who, once we knew who was finally going to be our unelected Prime Minister, they made a video telling Scott Morrison what they wanted. So the first one was that he should concentrate first and foremost on lowering electricity prices, that he should forget all about emissions reduction targets, but very, very importantly in my book, they want Australia to pull out of Paris. So my question specifically for Tim is, do you want to see Australia leave its Paris commitments behind?
Well, the new Prime Minister has already said we're not going to, and I think, frankly, I think Paris is a furphy in terms of the people saying we should pull out big for all these different reasons, because I don't actually think, frankly, it's that big a deal in terms of what we're already cutting our emissions against what Paris sets out. I don't see any compelling case to do so.
So what were the young people on about in your organisation, the IPA? What were they on about then?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the question.
Well, the question is, why are they saying it if it's not?
They've got a view.
Since you're a member. Yeah.
I don't know, but I'm a member of lots of organisations, and I don't actually take a brain bypass and apply it to what other people say. I make my own informed decisions.
But you have some insight, right? You were the Director of Climate Policy at the IPA.
Yep.
Right? That's, just a small...
a decade ago, yeah.
A decade ago, but at a time when the IPA had that strident view. So you've got an insight that you could share.
Paris wasn't even negotiated a decade ago.
But Kyoto was, right?
Sure.
Yep.
But I presume it's because they think that it will have consequences, which I don't share, that view. But I haven't actually gone to have a conversation with them, so I wouldn't know.
Well, I'm very pleased you don't share that view. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I don't think we need to do another 2 minutes, do we?
Thank you.
I'd kind of say, I've been trying to meet with the folks at the IPA who write all the briefing papers that get put into the mailing, into the pigeonhole of every MP in the country, and the folks who get on the drum frequently, the guys who have a disproportionate voice in our energy discussion. I've been trying to have a meeting with them for more than a year now to talk about the massive errors of fact in their work, and I find it fascinating that they're absolutely refusing to just even sit down and have a coffee. So Tim, if you've got any strings you can pull at the IPA still, I would just love to sit down with Daniel Wild and those folks and see if we can find a meeting of minds on the facts. We'll have different opinions, but on the facts we should agree.
I'm quite sure that if they want to meet with you, Simon, they'll meet with you.
Well, I think they don't.
Well, that's their choice. but I'm not going to force people to meet with other people.
No, but I think I'd love it if you could use your charm.
Because I believe in a free society where people have the freedom to associate.
No, they've got the freedom. I'd just love it if you could use your wonderful charm.
Oh, right.
Let's let Tim and Simon organise that privately. Ladies and gentlemen, I think we probably could continue the discussion until 9 a.m, but I'm not going to put you through that. can I first thank you all for coming along. Thank you to David and his team for organising tonight. It is a big discussion. It's been a focus of attention for some years amongst Australians.
Yeah.
And will no doubt be for years to come. There are some good examples in the world. I was going to bring up California, which has got a different model to us and seems to have had a flat emissions profile since 1972 by introducing better regimes.
You're going to mention Senate Bill 100 from yesterday?
Sorry?
Do you know about Senate Bill 100 in California? Yesterday, California voted to put through Senate Bill 100, which is to be 100% renewable by 2045. 2045.
Yeah.
Yep.
Are they still going to buy energy from interstate?
I think it's probably a net zero.
Yeah.
So they will cease buying energy. One of the things that we didn't get onto is, do we support nuclear or not? That would be an interesting conversation.
That's a really easy conversation, but we can.
Well, it depends on whether you want to get emissions to zero.
That's the other thing that happened yesterday. South Africa pulled out of nuclear and is going renewables. So anyway, look, I need to conclude. Thank you all very much. But would you please join me in thanking Tim and thanking Simon?
Yeah, on that note, Tim has had a difficult couple of weeks and a bit of a challenge to come here, but we do thank you, Tim, for making it. Yeah.
Can I ask a rude question? What percentage of the room is, or put your hand up if you're a constituent? Okay, that's a fair few.
Wow.
Yeah. No, it's just some people coming from outside, so I was just curious what percentage.
So, not to forget Simon and Rob.
McNamara.
The three of you gave up your valuable time to be with us tonight and give us a very informative discussion, which I think we all appreciate. What do you think? And as a token of this appreciation, I think my colleague is mounting the other side of the stage with some paper bags. 2 of them are marked red for the red people.
Don't assume too much.
I know one of our speakers doesn't drink red, he collects gin.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. I thought they were talking about red.
Anyway, thanks very much for all of us. And on that note, thanks to Firbank for these wonderful facilities and the very helpful staff who've made our job here really, really easy. All the special BCCAGers who work so hard behind the scenes to make this happen, thanks very much. We do appreciate your help. Now, unfortunately, the budget didn't run to coffee, but we do have fresh water. So, other point, if you really want to get involved and help us to do more to save the planet, you're not involved in another group, you're very welcome to join ours. On the way out, there's Annette, just stood up. She's very happy to sign you up and we'll find jobs for you, don't worry. So